Welcome, everybody. We're just waiting for a few seconds until everybody finish entering. Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Sarah Gomez, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Environmental Studies Program at Tufts University, which brings you the Hope Cunningham Environmental Lecture Series every week. This series is made possible thanks to the generosity of Tufts alumni, siblings, Daphne Hoke Cunningham and Roland Hoke and their families. If you would like to receive alerts about these talks, or if you are a student in the room wanting to hear about internship opportunities or job opportunities, feel free to sign up for either or in the link we'll post in the chat. And if you want to learn more about the last talk in the series this year, or if you want to have a sneak peek when we post a new roster for the fall, we'll also put a link there for that. Finally, before we introduce today's speakers, I just wanted to remind everybody that the chat is deactivated. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible at the end of the talk. Finally, this meeting is being recorded. So if you want to access the recording or share with your colleagues and friends, we'll also post the links to all of the recordings in the chat. And today I have the great pleasure of introducing environmental attorney and longtime community organizer, Amy Laura Cahn. Amy Laura Cahn is currently a visiting professor and acting director of the Environmental Justice Clinic at Vermont Law School, where she collaborates with organizers and communities to address the effects of racial segregation, neighborhood disinvestment, and environmental risk, while at the same time supporting self-determination. Prior to joining VLS, she was at the Conservation Law Foundation, where she led the Healthy Communities and Environmental Justice Program. And before that, she spent 5 years at the Public Interest Law Center in Philadelphia, where she was the director of the nation's first urban agricultural law clinic. She has also clerked for the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania and the Superior Court of New Jersey's Appellate Division. She currently sits on the Penn Law Alumni Advisory Board for Inclusion Bluestockings Bookstore. Last but definitely not least, we were very lucky to convince Amy Laura, in collaboration with our friends at the Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning Department, to offer an undergraduate and graduate level class on climate change policy and adaptation at Tufts this semester. So Amy Laura, thank you so much for all your contributions to our students and for being here today. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Coco and Colin, for having me join such an impressive and inspiring cadre of speakers. And thank you to both and to Mary and Julian for welcoming me into the Environmental Studies program and into UEP to teach climate policy planning and action this semester. I'm going to start by just putting a link into the chat for a Google Doc of slides. We're going to, rather than having a PowerPoint behind me, for those of you who are visual learners, there will be some textual analysis, and you can follow along via Google Doc if you want. So I wanted to start by just saying that this talk comes out of my community-based movement lawyering practice. But it's also really an extension of the conversations that I've been having with my UEP and environmental studies students. So in many ways, you're joining that conversation today. And we've been asking this question of what is good environmental and climate policy, and how do we make another world possible? And the former is really the students' question to me. What is good policy? How do we make good policy? And the latter has been my question to them. How do we imagine another world being possible? And we're grappling with the fact that good policy and making another world possible rely on creating new and different and more just ways to make good policy. And what do I mean when I say good policy? We'll come back around to this, but when I think about good environmental and climate policy, good and just, I think about that it requires identifying root causes, acknowledging and accounting for past harms, thinking holistically and identifying cumulative burdens and creating holistic solutions. I think about enforcement with teeth, self-determination of all people, but centering Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. And when I say self-determination, I think about autonomy, ability to dictate terms, ownership of resources, and the requirement that we shift and share power. And then increasingly, particularly in the climate context, understanding from the concept of intersectionality brought to us by Kimberly Crenshaw, that multiple marginalizations can compound harms. So we also need to think about centering people with disabilities, undocumented folks, queer and trans people of color, particularly youth, poor and the working poor, and labor. And I start often in this conversation by looking back to the history to understand what happens when we don't do these things. And I spent about 5 years kind of embedded in a community called Eastwick when I lived in Philadelphia. So I spent about 5 years of Wednesday evenings, plus many, many more conversations in a community that is nestled between the Schuylkill and Delaware rivers, bordered by the Philadelphia International Airport to the south, as well as by this country, bordered by this country's oldest and largest oil refinery to the east, and the John Hines National Wildlife Refuge and Darby and Cobbs Creeks to the northwest. And Eastwick, back in the day, if you think back to the 30s, 40s, was a well-loved, and in the words of Dr. Mindy Fullilove, knitted-in community with vibrant and walkable commercial corridors amidst areas of farmland and marshland adjacent to the wilderness that would eventually become Hines Refuge. And I think back to my friend Terry Williams, who lives there, who roamed that wilderness as a child. And it was in one of, or perhaps the only intact interracial community in Philadelphia at the time. It was also, in the words of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, an area of detrimental influences, primarily African-American and immigrant, and that those detrimental influences were a lack of sewers, that it was 8 feet below river level, and had, and this is to quote again the Homeowners Loan Corporation, who were responsible for the thing that we call redlining, an undesirable Negro section of a very poor property, unquote. And clarifying remarks stated that this area was, quote, considered the worst section in Philadelphia, that, quote, favorable influences of this neighborhood were, quote, nothing. A 1957 study conducted by the Institute for Urban Studies for the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority goes into significantly more detail about the environmental issues and, quote unquote, sources of blight in and around. Large swampy or marshy sections subject to frequent flooding, which must be brought up to grade to fill, extensive areas of open burning garbage dumps, which create odor, smoke, and rodent problems, and traffic, which gives rise to noise, fumes, and the danger of traffic accidents. External blighting factors included heavy commercial traffic, the Philadelphia International Airport, problematic due to serious noise problem, and concentration of heavy industry, as well as other unharmonious land uses, which are unsightly and give rise to odors, smoke, and ashes. So these factors, along with the fact that this was one of the areas of the greatest amount of open land in Philadelphia, led to the blighting of Eastwick, which is the gateway, continues to be the gateway for the assertion of eminent domain, which is really an assertion of police power to take away land. It was the justification for the creation of the largest urban renewal project in history, the justification for seizing 2,300 acres of land, displacing 8,000 people, along with 27 churches, 2 firehouses, 5 schools, 169 commercial buildings, and 11 industries. That act opened up $22 million in federal loan funds and translated into a 50-year purchase option for redevelopment for one developer, all of which baked into a development with all of the existing environmental harms. So all of the things that led to the blighting of Eastwick and the seizure of Eastwick from the community, none of that was repaired. So a community was built in the farmland, amongst the farmland and marshland, below sea level, on insufficient pilings such that the home sunk, and adjacent to a Superfund in and around the airport, and then eventually with I-95 running through it. So degraded air quality, as well as chronic and catastrophic flooding. And this is a community that was then marginalized from decision-making up and through till 2012, when residents found out by accident about a zoning proposal that was intended to bring, kind of finish up the job of urban renewal to develop the remaining 128 acres as 722 units of multifamily rental and 134 parking spaces. The decision itself at that time was a foregone conclusion as the result of a closed-door court settlement and a decision by the city council president in Philadelphia that no engagement of the community was needed. And that is the point at which I got involved. And it really is kind of the tale of, or a tale, and how I really understand very deeply environmental justice and environmental racism. I also want to kind of bring in another and more recent issue of environmental racism, kind of closer to what I now call home in Chelsea, Massachusetts, where, you know, Chelsea has been dealing with for years with many of the same issues that, you know, patterned on Eastwick. Again, an area that was historically redlined, an area that is dealing with compounded industry adjacent to an airport. Again, you know, transportation running through, as well as insufficient transportation for the community itself. That, you know, transportation system that is both overburdened and overburdening the community in its air quality. And in 2014, the Eversource proposed to put one additional facility, piece of infrastructure in Chelsea and East Boston, to bolster the electrical, its electrical infrastructure, proposing a substation and transmission lines. And the community fought back starting in 2014, because, you know, out of fear and concern and a real, you know, being really tired of cumulative overburdening of the community. And just to quote a kind of a recent article, as this case came to a close from Merriam-Webster in BOR, electrical substations convert high voltage electricity to a lower voltage for distribution, and we need them to keep the lights on. But many residents of East Boston and Chelsea say building one on a flood-prone area near wooden triple-decker homes and a popular playground is a bad idea. They would rather see it built at a nearby Logan Airport, which uses a substantial amount of the electricity in East Boston and is both fenced off and better protected from climate change-induced flooding. It is a case of too much in my backyard. East Boston is already home to huge tanks of jet fuel, not to mention air and noise pollution from Logan Airport, and heavy truck traffic on Route 1A. On most workdays, it is also clogged with commuters fighting to squeeze into the Sumner Tunnel. And again, like Eastwick, where there was a systematic cutting off of community input. In 2017, I learned about this issue when residents went to a hearing of the Energy Facilities Siting Board, in which, you know, the 20 residents, Spanish-speaking residents from a majority Spanish-speaking community, came and asked for simultaneous translation and were told it would be disruptive. So this is the history of environmental injustice and environmental racism that I'm talking about. The history is also a movement history. And so I want to jump to a recent article in the Washington Post, which really kind of brings home this deep history, not just of injustice, but of organizing for justice. And I will quote from that article about an event that one might refer to as one of the origin points of the environmental justice movement. The article is entitled "How a Protest in a Black North Carolina Farming Town Nearly 40 Years Ago Sparked a National Movement." In Warren County, North Carolina, Ben Chavez was driving on a lonely road through rolling tobacco fields when he looked in his rearview mirror and saw the state trooper. Chavez knew he was a marked man. Protests had erupted over North Carolina's decision to dump 40,000 cubic feet of soil contaminated with cancer-causing chemicals in a poor Black farming community in Warren County, and Chavez was leader of the revolt. The trooper pulled him over. "What do I do, officer? What did I do, officer?" Chavez asked that day in 1982. The answer shocked him. "He told me I was driving too slow." Chavez was arrested and thrown in jail. When the cell door slammed shut, he gripped the metal bars and declared, "This is racism, environmental racism." And that article from the Washington Post on April 6th really starts in that point and goes through the history of the environmental movement. And I was really struck by a quote from Vernice Miller Travis, who's the executive vice president of the Metropolitan Group, but also co-founder of We Act for Environmental Justice in West Harlem, and really has played so many different roles. And she said, the conversation we started having was about environmental racism. Because everybody was uncomfortable with racism, we called it environmental justice. It's not accidental, it's all intentional. And so the environmental justice movement, though rooted in fighting environmental racism, was born. And I have been starting these conversations kind of thinking about that origin point and what is that, what has that movement asked of us and asked of me as a white community-based movement lawyer committed to this work. And I keep coming back to this letter that came out of the environmental justice movement by the Southwest Organizing Project and many, many other organizations, written to what they called at that time the Group of 10. And it was a letter that was written to the mainstream environmental groups saying, it has become clear to us that your organizations play an equal role in the disruption of our communities. There's a lack of accountability by the Group of 10 environmental organizations toward third world communities, what we might refer to as BIPOC communities now, in the Southwest, in the United States as a whole and internationally. And in many ways, it was a calling out or a calling in of mainstream environmental groups to really participate and show up and be accountable and really envision what is a good way of making policy and envisioning this other world that we need to see possible. And following on that letter, a group of I think over 1,000 people of color, EJ leaders came to DC for the first People of Color Leadership Summit and developed a set of principles of environmental justice that has led the work going forward. There are 17 principles, and I'm not going to read you all 17 right now, but I've been really focusing on 4 of those principles. And really this concept of self-determination. And I'll read those 4 to you. The first is environmental justice affirms the fundamental right to political, economic, cultural, and environmental self-determination of all peoples. Environmental justice demands the right to participate as equal partners at every level of decision-making, including needs assessment, planning, implementation, enforcement, and evaluation. Environmental justice protects the rights of victims of environmental injustice to receive full compensation and reparations for damages, as well as quality healthcare. Environmental justice affirms the need for urban and rural ecological practices to clean up and rebuild our cities and rural areas in balance with nature, honoring the cultural integrity of our communities, and provided fair access for to the full range of resources. And I say that I point to these, in particular, the first one about self-determination, because I really see that that's really at the core of how we need to think about, what it means to make decisions differently. And it is the thing that I think has been lost. The environmental justice movement did not just give us those 17 principles. They also gave us the James principles for democratic organizing that really tell us what does it look like to center self-determination in organizing, and I would also say in policymaking. It requires us to be inclusive. It requires an emphasis on bottom-up organizing, letting people speak for themselves, working together in solidarity and mutuality, building just relationships among ourselves, and a commitment to self-transformation. Now, in 1994, President Bill Clinton issued an executive order. It was really on environmental justice, Executive Order 12898. And there's something that happened with the issuance of that executive order that I continue to come back to, which is really the gap between the principles of environmental justice and the Hermes principles, and then what we see in this executive order. And I would say the executive order, it's 5 pages. It includes a definition of environmental justice and some guidance, and as well as a set of directives for agencies to take. But it really kind of culminates in an EPA definition of environmental justice that has gained a lot of traction. And the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency definition, says that environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policy. And that this goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards, equal access to the decision-making to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. And there's a gap here. And, I'm not saying to you that I don't think that there should be fair treatment and meaningful involvement. And I do believe that, everyone should enjoy the same degree of protection from environmental health hazards and equal access to decision-making. But the gap here between the policy, the principles and the policy is that, this issue of self-determination really fell out the bottom. That what we have here in the EPA definition of environmental justice are is a good starting point, but it's also ahistorical and in some ways reductionist in terms of the view of harms and solutions. And it also kind of shows the gap in enforcement tools to address historic harms with holistic solutions, and kind of speaks to, why we have not gained as much traction on environmental and now climate justice as we could have in this intervening 30 to 40 years, because we're lacking civil rights protections. We're lacking an analysis of kind of the layered impacts that I talked about in Eastwick or in Chelsea and East Boston around cumulative impacts. And it lacks a kind of view of intersectionality, which, has kind of pervaded civil rights protections throughout. And then that there's an overall erasure of self-determination. And that, yes, this is a federal executive order, but it translates into limitations and constraints. And I would say sometimes a laziness at all levels of government, and then also within non-governmental organizations. Very clearly, we see the direct, it has a very direct impact in that this is how, this is the guiding document for how the federal government engages in environmental justice work. But it has also been directly imported into state policy, so that states are using the same kinds of definitions that focus on equal access and meaningful participation without looking broadly at history, without looking at cumulative impacts, and without thinking about what does it mean to really center self-determination for the people who are hurt first and worst. And culturally, it kind of sets affirmative expectations for what is necessary and that we don't have to go beyond. And it sets expectations around the lack of consequences that's perpetuated, not just by the definition itself, but the fact that we don't have the tools for enforcement, that we have a set of environmental laws that's focused on point source pollution without looking at the kind of cumulative impacts of layered environmental harms on individual bodies and whole communities. And that we don't have the civil rights protections that can ground us in the fact that environmental injustice is rooted in racism and historic segregation. And so what's the impact? And I will say, one of the ways that I talk about the impact of this is through my experience in Eastwick, which I would say is one of my greatest wins, one of our collective greatest wins and losses concurrently. Because in Eastwick, we were actually able to stop the rezoning. We were able to tell the story that, that there had been this historic set of harms that the community, somehow unbeknownst to people like the water department, was experiencing catastrophic flooding and chronic stormwater issues that were not being addressed, that the community had been cut out of planning for 50 years, and that it was waiting on a neighborhood planning process that would have happened after those apartments would have been developed. And that we actually got the redevelopment authority to buy back the land that had been, that was the remnant of the 50-year purchase option, and to carry out a planning and feasibility study, not just for that 128 acres, but the entirety of the land that remained in public ownership, 200 acres of land. And it was a 2-year endeavor that had 2 goals: empower Eastwick residents through an inclusive process to shape the future of their community, and provide a framework for responsible land use decisions to build a resilient neighborhood. And that sounds great. And yet, and this was a trauma-informed process that really recognized the history, that was rooted in an understanding of where we were going in terms of climate issues, because we're at the confluence of 2 rivers and 2 creeks, and we're in the floodplain, and the community had really no say over the outcomes. The outcomes, it was outcome determinative. We understood, that because the community has no land ownership, and because the redevelopment authority, who is the landowner, needs to recoup their losses, that there was no self-determination, that this was not, in fact, this was a community-informed but not community-driven process. I would say in Chelsea, in East Boston, the results at this point are kind of even worse. I sort of start with Eastwick because it's such a sort of jarring moment of we've come so far to not go far at all. In East Boston and Chelsea, I started from the place of the refusal to provide language access, which was a pattern that was repeated over the 3 years that I witnessed these proceedings around the electrical substation and transmission lines, and a kind of overarching resistance to kind of an inclusive process, all of which kind of culminating at the end with this self-perception that they had done everything they needed to do, because over time they actually improved in the language access, but with no impacts on the process itself. So, what we saw was, okay, we don't want simultaneous translation at the outset. Okay, well, we'll provide simultaneous translation, but we'll do it in a different room. Okay, well, we have to do it in the same room, but not with skilled interpreters. And all of this in the culmination during a pandemic with a community that's dealing with kind of all of these issues at the same time. And what it really, for me, it comes down to a statement at one of the final hearings by then Professor Shalonda Baker, who's now thankfully Deputy Director for Energy Justice at U.S. Department of Energy, that the 4 corners of EJ policy don't give space for the types of burdens we've seen echoed by the community in the comments. The types of cumulative impacts that are permitted for analysis under, in this case, the Massachusetts environmental justice policy are not necessarily parallel to the types of cumulative impacts that this project might contribute to, because the EJ policies speak primarily to emissions instead of other industrial impacts in a community. And so from the perspective of the state agency, they were providing meaningful participation, but that is as far as they need to go. And we're seeing that pattern of behavior kind of play out in the development and in a very worrisome way in the development of climate policy overall. And sort of seeing that, at the sort of tail end, there's this opportunity to bring people in to, whether it's, focus groups or planning sessions or listening sessions or workshop sessions, but that in many ways, the policies themselves are outcome determinative. and that, you know, the sense that we can check a box, and we have done environmental justice. And we've seen this. I was very struck by recently a letter from about 70 California environmental justice organizations to the Biden-Harris transition team about the role of Mary Nichols in the California Air Resources Board and the implementation of the cap and trade program in California, where they really pointed to the fact that there were a set of policies that have in fact increased pollution in communities while addressing greenhouse gas emissions in the aggregate. And a lot of this is really tied to a kind of lack of putting the people most affected at the center at the start. And we've seen this pattern kind of play out over and over again in climate policy making, both from environmental NGOs and from policymakers themselves. In California, in the context of the Waxman-Markey bill back in 2008, which proposed a national cap and trade program, in the development of the Transportation and Climate Initiative here in the Northeast region. And you have a set of environmental and climate justice organizations and networks that really understand with depth the problems at issue, have a set of solutions, and have been marginalized from this process. And this is the crossroads that we're at, where we need this historical and holistic view of harms and solutions. We need tools to address those historic harms with holistic solutions that provide civil rights protections, an analysis of cumulative impacts, and an understanding of intersectionality. And we need to start understanding, what does self-determination mean to shift and share power and resources. And we have roadmaps and we have pathways to get there. And this is why I continue to come back to the environmental justice and Jemez principles. We've also seen the emergence of a just and equitable climate platform, which has brought together environmental NGOs and environmental justice groups, kind of outlining where we need to go next. And we have principles for a just transition, which have really been articulated by Climate Justice Alliance and others, that ask for a transition from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy in a way that is just and equitable, that redresses past harm and creates new relationships of power for the future through reparations, and that really lays out not just where we're going, but how we get there, to the point that good policy requires us to create new ways to make policy. I've also been relying on a tool called the spectrum of community engagement to community ownership, which really, I think, provides developed by Rosa Gonzalez of Facilitating Power for the Movement Strategy Center, which really shows kind of where we have been in terms of community engagement and where we need to go to get to a point where where policymakers are collaborating with and then ultimately deferring to the communities most affected in decision making. Through my work at CLF, we also developed, just as a baseline, a set of community lawyering principles for how we go about this work, that we invest in relationships before action, that we're accessible and we listen, that we focus on how we work as much as what we do, and that we're evaluating equity impacts before advancing policy. There's a whole sort of set of them in the document. I won't read them for you, but we really need to understand how we're engaging in this work and how we can model different ways to do so. And so at the same time, I do actually have some models for hope and inspiration for what is good environmental and climate policy and whether another world is possible. And I've been thinking about, who is rethinking past decisions and decision-making and who's modeling new ways of making decisions. And so a couple, kind of sparks of hope to send us forward. One is I'm taking hope from permit revocations. So we've seen in 3 different instances, kind of over the past kind of less than 3 months, agencies kind of going back and rethinking, should this project be allowed? So in Weymouth, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is actually rethinking the compressor station that would be cited, that has been cited and has in an environmental justice community in Massachusetts. EPA has withdrawn a permit for the lime tree facility in St. Croix, citing environmental justice concerns. And in Massachusetts, the Department of Environmental Protection has said, we actually are going to revoke a 9-year-old air permit for a woody biomass facility that was proposed for Springfield, which is, a heavily overburdened community with enormously high asthma rates, and a community that has been fighting this facility for over 10 years. So we have this, sort of, maybe we're rethinking decisions, maybe things are happening differently. And then the Department of Transportation under Secretary Pete is saying, okay, and maybe we're going to use Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to do this, and has actually halted construction on the North Houston Highway Improvement Project, citing environmental justice concerns and saying we really need to rethink. So, here's an opportunity to kind of take a step back. We also have a couple of states coming up with new tools. So New Jersey and Massachusetts passing environmental justice laws that actually provide for cumulative impacts analysis, with New Jersey saying, if you find cumulative impacts of a facility that the Department of Environmental Protection may deny a permit based on cumulative impacts. And in New York, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act actually builds in not just climate issue mechanisms for reduction of GHG emissions, but is pairing those with a focus on air quality in overburdened communities. And then we also have a set of inspirations around kind of recentering how we make decisions that I think have the potential to move us towards self-determination. So rights-based approaches like not just the Green New Deal, but Green New Deals at a federal level, but also on a local level. We have models for community ownership and the commons, such as the Bologna City as Commons, which is now being, the city of Lawrence in Massachusetts is taking as a model for its resilience corridors. We have models of mutual aid and reparations, really asking us to think differently about how we operate on a day-to-day basis, but also redress harm for a host of issues, but centering climate in that. And then we have the abolition movement and the movement to defund the police. And I want to end there because I think, because for many reasons this week, I think we need to be sitting with that and the need to disarm and defund and abolish. But with that movement is really actually providing us a pathway to not just, think about our criminal justice system, but a shifting of resources and a shifting of decision-making about how we deal with public safety and past harm in a way that actually not just provides us lessons, but could provide us resources for bolstering communities in the face of climate change. And so with that, I will bring this to a close and ask you for, what are you inspired by? How do you think that we can shift decision-making, and where do we go next? And with that, I don't know if I hand it over to you, Colin, or I hand it over to Coco.
Well, Coco's been coming in and out. She's having some freezing issues on her connection. So I'm going to step in a bit. I want to invite the community listening to sort of ask some questions in the Q&A, and I will bring them to Amy Laura. And but I'll just get us started because I love your notion of self-determination. And as a biologist, I often try to think about cumulative impacts. And I'm trying to figure out where you can use it and where you can't. And so for air pollution, I could imagine, one more drop of air pollution is another drop on top of a really bad situation. So that's a cumulative impact. But I'm thinking about loss of land, like where it's not an immediate health impact on the community, but it's a a loss of green space. Where is cumulative impacts working and not working as you see it going forward, if that's a clear question?
No, I think that's a really good question. I think I would say a couple of things. One is that I don't think it's working at all in our environmental legal regime yet, because what we see because we don't actually have legal mechanisms to look at those drops upon drops upon drops of air pollution or water pollution, even if we're just looking at kind of those individual substances and looking under the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act. So, that is a really good place to start, is just to think about kind of how those layers, we do need to look, well, and then I would say that we should be, and one of the things that Shalonda Baker actually called attention to in the Eversource substation matter is that what the community was saying was that the substation was layered on top of exactly the things that you were talking about, which is, climate impacts plus what had initially been promised as community access, waterfront access and green space. So a potential loss of land plus, potential dangers around electromagnetic frequency plus. And so I actually think we need mechanisms that look kind of across different harms. And it's how do you quantify that? I mean, in some ways I need to look to communities themselves to tell me, but also to public health professionals to say, like, well, if you have impacts on multiple social determinants of health, what does that mean for someone's kind of well-being, both kind of emotionally, physically, and also kind of economically? And we don't have the tools to really do that. We can do that kind of from a planning perspective, affirmatively, if, by kind of centering these issues, but we don't have a way to kind of redress the harm or provide, we don't have consequences, I guess what I would say. But I do think that particularly with the impacts of climate being so varied, we need ways to synthesize those impacts to understand how they affect individual bodies and whole communities.
Well, that's amazing. I'm struck by, my son lives in Philadelphia, and so I can picture many of the segregations, many of the red lines that impacts many different communities within the Philadelphia area, but that's not just unique to Philadelphia. So I appreciate, and it's more than one angle of destruction that they're dealing with, and that must make this work really challenging. There is a question in the Q&A that I'm going to read to you, and if you can see it, you could read it as well, but I'm going to read it to the community. In the COVID-19 pandemic, where many are now engaging with educational digital platforms in their teaching and learning experience, how do we make these platforms more open and equitable so that community members have the freedom and space to choose, identify, research, and proactively address environmental injustices in their neighborhoods?
So I will say that it's been a really interesting year, because there are two ways I want to answer that question. One is in the absence of the digital divide, and then the other is to think about in terms of the digital divide. So in working with community members and community leadership that have access, I have found that we have made some gains, and we've seen some opportunities by using remote convening opportunities. So one of the things that I, experienced last year while I was at Conservation Law Foundation was that, I was part of the Massachusetts Environmental Justice Legislative Table, which is a coalition of groups that have come together around legislation, but organizing more broadly, that is anchored by Green Roots, which is in Chelsea and East Boston, and Neighbor to Neighbor, which works in multiple communities in Massachusetts. And so we were having monthly meetings, and then that resulted in us being invited to have periodic meetings with staff from the state environmental agencies. We were invited to have kind of periodic meetings with the Attorney General's office. And we ended up, there was a fair amount of, particularly with the AG's office, having a fair amount of cross-pollination in a much more accessible way because of this platform. And I've seen that also in our work through the environmental justice clinic at BLS, that our ability to kind of connect with folks around the country has been bolstered. And I think we really ultimately need to hat tip the disability justice community that has been really asking for this level of kind of accessibility and use of platforms that don't require in-person person participation, and so in that way I see real gains. At the same time, we still have this digital divide. And so the question is, how do you, yes, we can create spaces for really kind of robust and democratic public participation if we want to, but it doesn't, but that doesn't bridge the digital divide for folks who don't have that access. And so that's also what we found with the Eversource substation is that, yes, the Energy Facilities Siting Board committed to doing simultaneous translation for the final hearings around the substation in ultimately, I think 8 to 10 hours of hearings. Who can do that?
Wow.
Who can actually participate in that? And I think what we need to answer some questions about, well, do folks get compensated to be a part of public processes? How do we find different platforms that are, do we expect everyone to have smartphones? I don't think we can fully rely on these platforms and without either creating better access or ensuring compensation. And in many ways, it's going to need to be a balance as we return back to, or, we move into whatever the new world is.
It seems like as we move into that new world, there will be no longer an excuse to say, well, we don't have the technology to share it online for those who can't attend in person. So yes. It seems to me that there's going to be an expectation of city leaders, whether it's Chelsea, Boston, whatever, they're going to have to be more transparent. Are
yes.
you seeing that? Do you expect that outcome?
I think that there is I think we are raising, I think many others besides me are kind of raising expectations around transparency. I think we are seeing, I don't know, there are certain kind of, I've been inspired by things like this sort of set of permit revocations that I noted. I been inspired by the Providence climate justice planning process that really kind of centered a racial justice working group. I think we've got some, at a local level, there are different pushes for accountability at levels that we, maybe have not seen. And in thinking of, in one project that I was working on at CLF, with folks in Holyoke, specifically neighbor to neighbor, but also the city of Holyoke, we were looking at governance, how do we find governance structures that are actually, community led and really kind of that abide by the principles of community ownership that you see in that spectrum from Movement Strategy Center. There are very few. Okay. And so that's something that, I think that's something to work towards. Similarly, as we look to the Biden administration, it's very heartened to see the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council be convened, and with so many great leaders, including Maria Belen Power from Green Roots, and also one of the critiques of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council that EPA has convened for many, many, many years is that groups comes together, has the expertise, has a lot of on the ground knowledge, as well as, a set of folks who are kind of grounded in kind of research and data, and advocacy. And there's really a real power divide. There's a kind of absence of power there. It's purely advisory. And so, is there a willingness, and can this administration, show a willingness to shift power?
Great. Kathy Stanton writes a really important question here. Sometimes there's a clear community with more or less a unified voice, and sometimes there's internal dissent or division, or community organizing is still just getting going. What strategies have you seen as most productive and equitable in those situations, especially when there's a pressing issue on the table?
It's really, that is a hard one. And I think in any situation, it's good to start by saying there is not just a community. I often hear people refer to the community, and communities are not monoliths. And so in any community, I think there should be an expectation that there is heterogeneity, and that there are often some core principles to organize around. And I think the question is, can you find what those are? I think, we're actually finding that I'm thinking a very different example than probably where this question came from, but the Transportation and Climate Initiative. There's been a real divide between the mainstream environmental groups that have really pushed for the market-based solutions for a long time, and a set of groups led by environmental justice groups that are saying this does not meet our needs and has the potential to ultimately cause harm for any number of reasons, including just kind of sucking the air out of the room in terms of, and stealing all the political capital and transportation policy and resources. And so the solution, not the solution, but one step forward has been to say, okay, well, what can we come together on? What are the unifying principles, and then what are the unifying policies that can bring us together? And I think that's a starting point. The other thing that cannot be overstated is just relationships. And whether it's, as an advocate, spending time and knowing people and having them know me, similarly for policymakers and similarly for community members themselves, if you don't know people, if you're not connected, then it's really impossible to have those hard conversations. So there's not one answer to that question, but that's at least, where I would start.
Well, it's a similar theme amongst many speakers, is you have to build the community to create a community that are united. So, because they're not necessarily going to start that way. Sort of building on this sort of idea of sort of the private sector, the marketing, Danielle Cadenow, if I pronounced your name right, I hope, due to new private sector strategies like the shared value approach and the ESG, environmental, social, and governance, there is evidence that companies need to consider more than profit. Do you think these themes of acknowledgement, cumulative burden, and self-determination can apply to the private sector in any way, shape, or form?
I think they can. And I think there are limits. And I also think there is also this thing called greenwashing, and that can be analogized to many other things. But so I think, if I think about, there are a number of companies there are B corporations and that have taken that have shifted how they make decisions, such that, you know, I don't know if it's social, it has to be social justice, but that, you know, that decisions are not purely made on the basis of shareholder profits. So that's, you know, that's one approach. There's the notion of a triple or quadruple bottom line as being an evaluating principle for how you make decisions. You could build into that quadruple bottom line the, you know, redress of past harm. You could build into quadruple bottom line analysis the, you know, the notion of cumulative burdens, and in some ways the notion of quadruple bottom line, where you're looking at, you know, the economic, the social, the environmental, and the health, is actually a form of kind of a sort of can be a more holistic, you know, cumulative approach. I think the self-determination question is bigger, because it really requires shifting of power and shifting of resources. And then the caution is really, like, we have seen, you know, a lot of companies, particularly out of the Black Lives Matter movement, and this racial reckoning of the last year, so many companies saying Black Lives Matter, so many companies, you know, speaking to, you know, the issues around climate, you know, without actually, you know, walking the walk when it comes to kind of impacts for workers or impacts on, you know, the environment. And so there's a real, there is the potential for a disconnect or for a co-optation there.
So as consumers, we should beware of greenwashing coming out of the private sector.
I would say greenwashing, and then I don't know what the analogous term would be, because maybe someone has come up with one in the context of racial justice, but I'm sure, but that concept as well.
Environmental justice washing.
Yeah, it's really, it's a little, yeah, but
yeah,
that's yes.
Aram Sattar writes, while we know that infrastructure is failing and there are significant shortfalls of resources and financing for maintenance that affect marginalized communities the most, we are also confronted by an ideological commitment to small underfunded government. How in your experience do communities organize to change this blocking status quo?
This is where I need to become an economist. And I have not yet. So, but there are,
we have 1 minute left, so you just make it quick.
No, yes, so the answer is that there are people, there are feminist, ecological economists who can answer this question better than I. So I'll just defer to them on that question. But then I do see that I see a couple of my students. So can I answer their questions?
What I'm going to do is I'm going to officially end it for anybody who wants to leave. I want to give you a round of applause, but we'll stay on, and anybody wants to, and you can answer the questions to those people who choose to stay on. But I wanted to, because some people have to get to class, I wanted to make sure to give everybody a chance to thank you, and me a chance to thank you. And I appreciate it very much, and definitely eye-opening. And I loved your ability to sort of bring the various case studies to bear on these really difficult issues. So thank you, Amy.
Well, thank you for having me.